Be the envy of the neighborhood. 860 KKAT, where the grass is always greener. Welcome to Gardening Utah. Here's composter and show hoster, Jana Francis.
Welcome to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis. Every week here on Gardening Utah, we give you gardening inspiration and advice from experts across the state. We talk about vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, and of course, your lawn. Thank you for listening. I hope this show is something that you'll look forward to checking in with every week. Whether you're a beginner or an expert, Gardening Utah aims to inspire you and keep you in the know of what tasks you should be accomplishing in your yard and meet amazing, informative experts along the way. This show airs on the radio on the weekends here in Utah at 10 a.m. on 860 AM KKAT, and episodes drop every weekend on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, so hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. On today's show, we have the amazing Cynthia B. with Localscapes joining us, and we are going to be talking about all of the different projects that you might need to be tackling in your yard this year, whether it be just simply maybe adding a new flower bed, maybe you are looking to just replace a certain part of your yard, like flipping your strip, the park strip, or maybe you don't have a yard yet at all and you're really just looking for a foundation of how to put that together. Well, that is what Cynthia B. is here for today. And if you haven't heard of Localscapes, it is an approach of landscaping patterns and practices that really take into account Utah's very unique climate. And essentially, it's just very foundational and great landscape design simplified. And there's a series of classes that you can take that will really walk you through exactly what you need to do with your yard. And even if you need to tackle it over several years, it helps you sort of prioritize and identify what needs to happen and when. So I'm really excited for this episode because we really get into it. Cynthia was in a past episode. Cynthia was in episode 10 of Gardening Utah. You can go back to listen to that one, and it really gives the foundation of what Localscapes is. But today we're going to kind of tackle the ins and outs of certain particular things in your yard that you may need to accomplish this year. And we really talk about water conservation and what that means for each of us individually. And I just learned so much from her in this episode, so I cannot wait for you to hear it. Let's get into it. But first, the tip of the week.
860 KKAT with your Gardening Utah tip of the week.
Whether you have seeds that you've nurtured yourself and grown indoors, or brand new plants that you've bought from the local nursery, quite often those plants need a helping hand in order to grow well outdoors. So here's how to harden off your vulnerable vegetables, fruits, and flowers. If you're new to starting your own seeds or you've just purchased sprouts in your store, you may think that since the tiny plants have grown a few inches and sprouted a few leaves, you can just put them from their sheltered spot indoors right to outside in your garden. We've all been there and done that, but don't jump too quickly from planting from a container to the garden shovel, because those too early plants rushed into the ground are kind of like a toddler just learning to walk. They haven't learned all the ins and outs of the delicate dance from hand-holding to full steam ahead. So seedlings are tender and they've been sheltered their whole life. Think about it. They have been indoors, so they haven't experienced, direct sunshine. They also haven't experienced wind. So like a toddler, those newborn plants need an extra step in their growing cycle. So in order to transition them successfully from inside to outside, they need a little loving care, and that is what is called hardening off. So basically, hardening off describes slowly exposing newly grown vegetables, fruits, and flowers to the elements, changing temperatures, varying levels of sunlight and wind to enable healthy growth. And while it doesn't take a ton of time, it does involve some vigilance and a few steps. So first off, number one is to make sure that you start hardening them off before the seedlings' frost dates are up. So you want to get a little bit of a step ahead. So for example, if you're about to plant tomatoes that have only been indoors, you're going to want to start about a week before you're going to get those in the ground, which most often in Utah is about mid-May. Then you're going to want to choose a hardening off spot that the seedlings will get some protection from wind and sun in their first couple hours outside. You have a couple options, including a shady spot against your home, a table under a tree, or inside a cold frame. And then put your seeds outside for about an hour in the mid to late afternoon. Now, move them to a hardening off spot for just an hour or two, and then make sure the plants aren't getting bashed around by the wind and that they're protected from pests, like not going to get stepped on by the dog or any animals. And then move your plants back indoors. And at the end of that first day's hardening off time, put them back inside. And if they're in a cold frame, close and secure the opening. And then each day, leave your seedlings outside for an hour or more than the previous day, gradually giving them more and more direct sunlight at a time. And at the same time, you can move them to a less sheltered location, so further away from the house where they might experience a little bit more wind or a little bit more direct sun, for example. And then protect them as needed. If the temperatures are going to dip, if it's going to, rain really hard or snow that day, then don't do it at all. Just take your time. But if the temperatures dip during the hardening off time, you need to bring them back inside or into the cold frame or wherever you're growing them. And just make sure that you do this gradually and protect your seedlings as needed. This will ensure that the investment and time you've already made in planting these plants will make sure that when they get out in the garden, they're strong, they can protect themselves from the wind, and they won't get burned by the sun, and we will have our happy, happy plants.
And that's your Gardening Utah Tip of the Week, brought to you by the Advocates. If you're in an accident, you deserve an advocate. Call 801-355-5550 or visit utahadvocates.com. Never miss a tip for your garden and never miss an episode. The Gardening Utah Podcast with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Okay, a couple quick things before we jump right into our guest today, which is Cynthia B. with Localscapes. We have a contest going on. You've got to check it out. Go to 860kkat.com/contest-2. Now listen, I'll put this in the episode notes so you can just look at the notes in Apple Podcast or Spotify and it'll link you right there. But just go to KKAT's website and click the contest button and it will take you to our contest to be entered to win a 4x8 raised garden box from Q&R Box Gardens. It's kind of insane. And if you didn't hear their episode, they were on our show last week. We talk all about the benefits of raised bed gardening as well as what you put in them and on and on. But we're giving one away every single month for 6 months. And this is the first month. So you have a huge chance of winning. So again, go to 860kkat.com, click the contest button and enter to win that. Then we also have before the end of March. Now these deals expire March 31st, so take advantage of them. We've got a deal from harvestgoldorganics.com, which is an amazing premium soil conditioner. If you go to their website and use the code JANA50, you will get 50% off anything at harvestgoldorganics.com, which is totally crazy. By the way, I love adding their product. I just use 1 part Harvest Gold to 9 parts, whatever else I'm using, whether it's indoor plants, whether it's planting my seeds, whether it is outside. I just use that kind of mixture and it works great for me. Then you can go to, True Leaf Market, who we had on a couple weeks ago, still have a promo code to get $10 off a $50 purchase on anything at trueleafmarket.com. Use the code JANA10. And there's even more deals. You can click into the episode notes on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and you can check it out there. And just click over to all the great deals that we have for you here at Gardening Utah. I hope you enjoy. Okay, we'll be right back after this with Cynthia B. from Localscapes right here on Gardening Utah. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden. Here's Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and with me today is our amazing guest, Cynthia B. with Localscapes. Cynthia, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm always excited to talk about gardening and landscaping with Utahns.
Oh my word, yes. And we had you on the show last year talking about the very particular steps of Localscapes, and I know that our listeners love that episode. So if you're listening to this now and you want to get the actual steps one by one, you can go back to that episode. I'll even link it to you in the episode notes. But now since then and since the pandemic started, we've now had a year to kind of really start improving our yards and dig into our yards, literally, and, really start improving different spaces. And now it seems like things are going to start coming back to normal. At least that's the way it appears. So I kind of feel this massive sense of urgency to get so many things done in the yard before life kind of goes back to where it is. And so I know that I'm not the only one feeling that. So what do you think, Cynthia? Where does the homeowner start with all the different tasks that they need to accomplish?
It can be really overwhelming. We've all had a year to be at home and see everything that wasn't working, right? Like when you're busy, maybe you don't notice so much or whatever. You've been able to observe how, since your kids can't go other places, what is or isn't in the landscape. And you know what? Awesome. I hope that they've developed a habit of playing outside. We want to build on that and keep them engaged and interested in the actual real world that surrounds them. And so, it's just good timing. I mean, by summer, we may all be back in, fingers crossed, we may all be back to regular life. And so we do have just a couple more months of really a chance to make a difference. And so the main thing that we would want people to know is and I've noticed this when I talk to homeowners, the minute they find out what I do, that I have a landscape design background, and the first thing they want to know about is the plants. And yeah, there are amazing, awesome plants out there, but there is no such thing as that soulmate plant that's going to solve all your problems. And most of the time, plants are just the part we know. It's the part that rises above the ground that we see. And so that's what we think of. But the truth is, the really great yards are made at the ground level. And it's how we're utilizing spaces and how we're defining those with both living and non-living things, right? With, hardscape and mulch and paths and all these different parts of the yard that we usually just kind of think about as an afterthought. That's the beginning. And so when you kind of start with plants as your beginning, or we're working in a reverse order, then you have no choice but to reverse engineer things as different things fail or they don't work, or it just wasn't the right thing in the right spot, and you're not sure what the right spot is. And it's like, I got that plant because I was trying to fix this problem and it didn't fix the problem. And it's because the problem isn't usually the plant. The problem is most likely at that ground level. And so, you can absolutely change your yard a small project at a time. We've set the whole Localscapes thing up to really be conducive to that, because that's the reality of budget for almost all of us, right? Like very few people can afford to just go do the whole thing at once. And even fewer can afford to hire the whole job out, which is awesome if you can. I'm intensely jealous because I'm in year 10 of my yard overhaul, but
same,
a piece at a time. But we want to make sure that those pieces matter, because the only thing harder than having to do these projects is having to do them over when you're not even sure why it didn't work the first time. So we want to avoid that. We want to make sure that every dime you're spending in your yard is actually getting you closer to the way that you want to live in it.
Isn't that the truth? Doing it right the first time saves you so much time and heartache in the long run, and money.
Yeah. And so one of the great things with the way that the Localscapes works, and as they go back and listen to that previous episode about the different steps, each step, as you listen to it, think about what ground plane materials you'd be using. So in that central open shape, it's probably going to be lawn for most people. It might not be. But as you start thinking about, that's part of what you want to think about, that just as much as the plants. And by doing that, you're going to create those, we've heard that outdoor rooms concept, which is really cool, but it doesn't tell you how anything relates to each other. And so with Localscapes, it really does. It shows you, okay, prioritize this, and then we do this step. And we try to work that through. But what we really want people to do is just think about it, puzzle it out. Let's get something solved. Let's think about sprinklers as part of it. We had in 2019, we had GardenCom here in Salt Lake City, and that was all the garden writers, podcasters, bloggers from all over the United States. And that organization's been around for 50 years, and they've been west of the Mississippi 3 times. And this was their first time in the Intermountain West. And so when you think about that, they're not experts in this climate. They are experts in their own climates, as everybody is. And so with gardening information, that's why it's so great to have Utah Gardening as a resource. Extension, the things that we're providing through Conservation Garden Park and Localscapes, those local things are the thing that matters to you, because advice that's perfect advice for another climate could actually be really bad advice here. And so that's the key, is just really seeking out the closest to home you can get from a qualified source to give that information is what's going to work for you. And it doesn't matter what works in other places. It matters what works here. If you're gardening in Utah, you want to know how to do it here. And I often joke too, I don't really teach gardening to gardeners. We teach landscaping to homeowners.
Yes.
It's a little bit different because gardening is an activity that you engage in the yard, and how much of that you have to do to have a nice yard is directly relational to how good a job you did landscaping in the first place.
Isn't that so true? It's the foundation of all of it.
Yep. So yeah, you can do a little bit. So we can do individual parts. So we teach classes on how to flip your park strip. Really awesome. We kind of call that the gateway drug. You know, when you flip your park strip and you experience how cool that is, you're like, what else could I do? Right.
Yeah.
And then this year we're actually adding some new classes on that too, because really that project by project is how most people are going to make some changes. And then just trying to create that better balance. So as you're starting to think through your yard, one of the biggest challenges that I've dealt with probably in the 10 years that I've been teaching Utah appropriate landscaping, and our other teachers at Conservation Garden Park are going to echo the same thing, that we just deal a lot with people thinking it's either this or it's this. You know, if an efficient if a inefficient landscape is all lawn with just a few shrubs, and an efficient landscape is cactus and lava rock, right? They're thinking like these two extreme views. And you can trace every problem in our country right now to extreme thinking. And so as our team created Localscapes, we looked at, okay, well, what's the middle ground in between that? Everybody's lifestyle is a little different. Their needs are different. Their stage of life is different. And their yard needs to be able to flex with all of those things. So how can we come up with something when you're dealing with like actual planted things and installed sprinkler systems? And, how can we organize a landscape in such a way that it can flex with the realities of how we actually live? Because what might have worked when your kids were little may not work so well for you as a retiree. And being able to make those adjustments to the yard without having to do significant overhauling every time is really where we're at. And so that's how we've kind of arranged these things into different projects. So yeah, you can just switch out the side yard, or how do you add a seating area? Those types of things. You don't have to do everything all at once. Most of our homeowners that have existing yards that are localscaping don't need to tear out their entire yard and start over. You can modify what's there. We can keep what's working, make adjustments, add new features. And as we're adding those features, be thinking about the ground plane again, because why? That's where your work is determined. So it's determined by if it's a living plant, it's determined by the way you're irrigating it in either of those circumstances. And then with your hardscape areas, that's where you get your balance. So you have this beautiful seating area that's surrounded by a planting bed, but the seating area, it doesn't need active maintenance. So you're enjoying that space, you're using it, it's adding to the curb appeal of the whole yard, but it didn't require you to have to manage every square inch of it. And that's really what we're trying to do for people, is help them find that balance for themselves. So, you can have up to 35% lawn in a localscape, and that doesn't sound like that much, but when you're using lawn properly, you can still have a pretty good chunk of lawn in that, in the front yard, in the backyard. And then you're just not putting it in the places you weren't using it anyway. And that's it. Like, we don't want to vilify lawn. Lawn serves a function that no other plant can serve, but it's not bad. We just use it badly. And we're just not in a place where we can continue on the path that we're on and not have some serious crises later. And so this is all about being proactive and thinking through your own life stages as well. I'm at the point now, my youngest is a senior in high school. We started transitioning our yard a few years ago to have more hangout spaces. I didn't need active play so much. I needed places for teenagers to hang out in my backyard because, you mostly know what happens at your own house.
That's right.
And so it's just making those adjustments. And now maybe, hopefully not for a few more years, I'll have grandkids. And at that point, I might want play spaces again, and I'll transition some of that space back. But I can do it because the space is already set up to be flexible, so that I just have to refurnish it, not re-landscape it.
I love that.
So that's a lot of what we're just trying to think through as we're doing these.
Yep. And long gone are the days of, I just got a new yard and we're just putting in the vinyl fence and laying the sod to the edge. Those days are gone, and they have to be gone. That's, it's not how you start your yard. You got to start.
It's interesting because we call that a cheapscape, because you're overwhelmed. You've spent everything you've got on the house, on the light fixtures and whatever else that nobody else is going to see. And then the yard we cheap out on, which is the one thing that you are guaranteed that everybody is going to see. But, and appreciates in value over time. Like as your property is appreciating, it's not your light fixtures that are making that happen, people. It's your landscaping. It's the value of the land that makes those prices go up the way. And you can see what they're doing right now, right? So we're paying incredible amounts for land, and then we're not utilizing it as part of our space to live. And so that's something that needs to adjust as well. And especially as lot sizes are shrinking, like you need to plan how to optimize what you have.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, when we come back right after this quick break, let's get into a little bit of water. I want to talk a little bit about irrigation and how people need to adjust their thinking on when that goes in. We'll be right back here on Gardening Utah. Stay with us.
860 KKAT with Jana Francis and Gardening Utah, where it's always mulch time. She really does have the nicest yard on the block. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and with me here is Cynthia B. from Localscapes, and we are getting all educated on Localscapes and how we need to rewire our thinking with regard to putting in our landscape, because Cynthia teaches, remind me the wording that you used, which I loved.
So we teach landscaping to homeowners, not gardening to gardeners.
I just love that so much, because the landscaping is the foundation of which then you end up gardening later on. And that just blows me away. And speaking of, I love this thinking so much because one of the reasons I started this show, and I'm not even exaggerating, is because I'm obsessed with saving water. And this is one reason why I love to talk to you so much, because I feel like if I can amplify and do anything to amplify that message alone, I've done a good job with my show. And so I recently had a friend reach out to me, and they have a brand new yard, which is not landscaped at all. And I said, so that's really exciting about your new place. What are you thinking of doing in the yard? And she said, well, I'll contact you later because I need to get my irrigation in first. We're putting the sprinklers in this weekend. And I was like, no, whoa, is this like the neighbors helping, or did you hire someone? Oh no, we've got somebody coming. I said, please cancel it. Let's back up, back up. And so what I explained, and you can tell me if I had talked about Localscapes properly, but first of all, I said, please go sign up for some Localscapes classes, because that will help you understand the things that you need to decide on what you're going to use your yard for. Because I said, what are you going to use your yard for? Well, entertaining. We want some pretty beds that we can sit down and look at. We want some garden beds. We want some edible landscaping mixed in. And so I said, okay, well, so where is that going to go? And she couldn't answer my question, because the mentality is, well, first we got to get in the sprinklers. So why don't you walk our listeners through the mentality around how that actually needs to be last?
Well, see, and that you identified a really good challenge. And it comes back to that thinking we talked about in the last segment, where when we think of our landscape, we think of the ground up, and that's not where it starts. Successful landscapes start at the ground plane down. And if you don't have that set up properly, then everything you put on top of it is money you're wasting, because it's not necessarily going to work out well over time. And then people are too overwhelmed. Like once they've done that once, they get overwhelmed about sprinklers and changing sprinklers, which is why we have a whole class on it. But that just feels really hard to people. And so they just don't make the changes. And so you back yourself into something through just a lack of upfront, because especially if you're dealing with a yard that's not installed yet, you're so sick of looking at the mud. You're like, whatever, I'm just going to get the lawn down and I'll worry about it later, except that you won't worry about it later. It will you all the time from there on forward. So, take a deep breath, and then let's think a little bit through that planning. So you identified some great things. How are you going to use the yard? What do you want to do? The big one I hear from people is, well, if I don't have all lawn, my kids will have nowhere to play. And, I've heard that. I can't even count on how many times I've heard that over the last decade. And there's the way that I answer it that's politically correct. but just know in the back of my mind, I'm thinking you must have the most boring kids ever. Because there are so many, like, give them opportunities to discover and explore and do more than just, you can still have lawn. We're not vilifying that. We just don't make an only lawn yard. So the first thing that you want to think about is that Localscapes 5 steps. And we walk you through all of this. In fact, we have the classes we're teaching via live webinar that are free. You can take an online on-demand class that's free. We have a whole design workshop that's set up to help you plan your yard. And even for people with existing yards, the design workshop is still a great idea because you're thinking about how you would redesign what you have and how to work around the things you have. But we do want you to take those classes in order so that you're building on those concepts. And once, don't skip straight to the design class because you need to understand what you're designing for first. And that's covered in the previous class in the series. So anyway, so we do offer that. You want to think about those spaces, what ground play material is going to be on those spaces. And then, of course, with irrigation, one of the best benefits of a localscape is we've totally simplified irrigation. Because instead of, and I remember this happened the moment that I got personal clarity on it, I was standing in front of a really nicely landscaped yard in Riverton. And I'm looking at this beautiful yard going, nobody that sees this yard knows it's a waterwise landscape. I know it because I work in the industry, but a regular person just driving by, it just looks like a gorgeous yard. Nobody would ever say that's a waterwise landscape. And why is that? And as I was looking at it, literally the sprinkler came on. Okay, wrong time of day to have it come on in the daytime, but it's still, the sprinkler flipped on and I watched as it perfectly watered just the lawn. And I realized, oh my gosh, we are landscaping backwards. We should be designing landscapes to fit sprinklers, not sprinklers to fit landscapes. And that's the mistake. If we create lawn areas that are clean and crisp in a bold shape, it becomes an organizing feature. We have one edge to trim and maintain, not a whole bunch of weird little gewgaw things that, suck up your Saturday. 100% of the lawn you have is available to your children for recreation. And I don't care how active your kids are in the yard. They're not using every ounce of lawn you have, every square foot for recreation. They aren't. They're using that middle section. And that's where we retain it in a localscape. It's the part they're using anyway. And I can tell people they can test this for themselves. Next time when it's finally time to mow, notice week to week where you are actually in the yard. So if I'm mowing along and I'm in a back corner and I'm like, the last time I was in this corner was last week when I was mowing, then you left a space that you could actually make something really interesting. And maybe last weekend you could have been sitting around the fire pit with the family instead of only being there when you're mowing. And so that's some of the things to think about. Just how are we going to put those spaces together? And then what are we going to use? How much time do I want to spend maintaining things? And we teach all of that through the classes to help people find their balance. But that's it. The idea that, oh no, there's a balance here that I need to achieve. And that'll be slightly different for everybody. And that's okay. That's okay. We'll teach you how to find it for you.
I love it. Tell our listeners, how do they sign up for these classes and where do you suggest they start?
Okay, so you can go to localscapes.com and we have different instructors all over the state of Utah. So we've got you covered and localized to you. For example, down in Iron County, they're doing a whole intensive Localscapes series at the end of the month for people that live in the Cedar City area and surrounding communities. St. George has actually taken the Localscape stuff. We work with the Red Hills Desert Garden down there, and they have adapted that concept to be local to St. George. So it's still the same 5-step method that we use anywhere in Utah, but they've adapted it a little bit more regionally to fit what works for them. And that's the whole idea behind this. And then we have Weber Basin Learning Garden teaches classes in Layton, and these are all virtual right now. So I guess, if you want to take a class from Layton folks and you live in Utah County, that's still doable if the date works better for you. We do have a group out of Orem, Central Utah is out of Orem. And then Utah State Extension also has instructors that teach Localscapes, and they teach that anywhere in the state of Utah. So literally, we are trying to get this to every corner. There is a way for every community to have this. We have actually had other states ask us if they could adopt Localscapes, and we've told them no, because we made this for Utahns. And if we let everybody use it, this is about what works here.
Yeah.
And the name to get watered down in terms of its meaning once everyone else starts using it and making their own adjustments and changes. We're like, no, you guys come up with your own thing. This is for Utah. We've been doing everybody else's way of landscaping for enough years. This is ours.
That's a really good point, because Utah is such a unique climate and such a vast, there's so many different microclimates, even just one city away. I mean, it's so dramatic.
Because our population base, because we're all at the bottom of ancient Lake Bonneville, just the way that the soils change in just short distances. I live 10 miles from my parents and they have straight sand and I have solid clay. There are 2 climate zones colder than I am. Just the amount of change, it's not it's Utah. This is a hard place to landscape. And so that's why that local information is even more important, because it can be regionalized just even within the same county to have slight differences. And so to help with that as well, we actually have Localscapes professional partners. We don't make any money off of that. We don't charge anything. And they come voluntarily wanting to partner because they believe in the Localscapes way of doing things and that message and what we can produce for our state as a result. And so they've come and we've trained them a little bit on the methodology. And so if you go to a Localscapes partner, whether it's a nursery or a designer or a landscape contractor or just even landscape products, we have all of those people in the Localscapes ecosystem. And the idea is that we all are speaking the same language. That was actually one of the challenges we tried to address up front, because, if you talked to a landscape designer, they would teach you a certain concept, and a nursery person might talk about that same concept, but using different terms. So how's a homeowner supposed to understand what's going on when even in the industry where we were using such different words to describe the same ideas? And so with Localscapes, it was just a way to unify that language so that as you're working through the process, if you're in that Localscapes ecosystem, everyone you're going to work with all the way through till you get to the end of your project knows those same words, knows how to explain it in a way that is consistent and that it means something. And so we definitely encourage, if you want to hire professional help or when you're looking for products and things like that, that the Localscapes professional partners, which you can find on the localscapes.com website, are a really great way to access some of that expertise.
I love this. You said you keep having these great moments of just these amazing mic drop quotes. And the one that I just loved was, "It's not you, it's Utah." That is fantastic.
True. It's hard here. It's hard to landscape here. So take a breath. It's okay. Even if it hasn't worked for you so far, between all of the different teachers that we have and all of our teachers have really strong professional backgrounds. We can help you get there.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we'll be right back after this, right here on Gardening Utah. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. 860 KKAT with more of the fastest growing show on radio. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and with me is Cynthia B. with Localscapes, and we are going to talk water in this segment. Cynthia, as I mentioned earlier, it's one of my biggest passions is finding ways to conserve water. And as we're talking about this, I wonder, how should we be as Utahns looking at our water situation? You hear, oh, it's snowing really hard, or it's not, or it's raining. Give us the real ins and outs of how we need to think about water conservation in Utah.
So Utahns are really good about paying attention to what's going on with the water year. We get lots of questions about that. I'm sure most of you kind of know we're behind this year. We're at about 75% of normal through most of the state, which is particularly concerning because we had such a long, hot, dry spell. We have been in what they categorize as an exceptional drought through most of the state. So Utahns are really good about looking to conserve when we need to. The problem is that, it's not just a single water year that determines our water supply. It's not just what we get, it's what we can keep. And so keeping as much as we can in our reservoirs should always be a priority. And I've had people say, well, if I don't use it, it's just wasted. Water that flows to Utah Lake or the Great Salt Lake is not wasted. We desperately need that water to keep getting water, lake effect snow. And for all the different things that are managed through those systems, if you don't use it, it's not wasted. So you want to use what you need and not more than that, right? And so it's trying to figure out what that should be and then reducing the overall amount that you need. So what we want to get away from is situational conservation, and we want to move more towards structural. So as we have people, as we're helping people re-landscape and localscape their yards, for example, planting beds are most often watered with overhead spray in most yards, because like we said earlier, you put the whole thing in sprinklers in, and then you decide what you're doing. Totally backwards. And so when they have planting beds, people get a lot of weeds, and they think, oh, I've got so many weeds because I have planting beds. They don't understand that it's because of how you're using water. If you want to control weeds, you've got to control water. And so the way that we control water is through the right structures in our yard. So the only place you should have overhead sprinklers in your landscape is on the lawn. And in a localscape, your lawn is that single bold shape. It's really easy to configure the sprinklers to be efficient and water just the lawn. And then your planting beds would be on drip irrigation, which, because planting beds need 6 times less water than the lawn does. So if you are watering your planting bed with overhead spray, and you're watering it just as frequently as the lawn, which, by the way, the planting bed needs once a week. And if you're using more native plants, you're looking at maybe once a month or once every 2 weeks at the hottest times of year. So, your beds need a lot less water than that lawn does. So if you're applying it 100% across the entire soil surface and you're applying it too frequently, you are growing weeds accidentally on purpose. So many weeds is because you are cultivating them. You're giving them all the optimal conditions. And so what we want to do in a localscape is really use the water that we need, apply it correctly, and then maximize it. Heavy mulch in those planting beds, drip irrigation, all of that is designed to bring that amount down. And so that we're using water as a tool rather than just kind of randomly spraying it. Like in my own yard, I use it to control growth of plants. If I don't want something to get super huge, I don't put as much water on it. And I actually have 2 plants where one I had a little leak and I let it go longer than I should have. And the size of those shrubs, they're the same shrub planted at the same time, same size. One is like half as big as the other one. I mean, it's twice as big. And it's because it got too much water. And the other one, I kept more controlled. And so now I've got to trim this one in order to make it look right. And so that's just part of it. Like if your yard is really overgrown, it's probably because you're overwatering. So it's a way to reduce your workload in so many different ways. Water is a tool, and few of us are really actually trying to wield it in that way. And so we want to teach people how to do that a little bit better, how to have the right setup in place that makes it possible for you to just always conserve. So you're not having to think about it. Anyone in the state of Utah can go to Utah Water Savers, utahwatersavers.com, and get a rebate for a smart controller. And your smart controller allows you to manage your sprinkler system from your phone, which is amazing. But it also tracks things. So if you have a spouse that might be prone to flipping on the sprinklers, that they watered, and you didn't, or you can have it on their automated settings if you choose. I like to make my own custom settings, but there's different parameters there. But that's an example of a way to structurally make a change so that you're just always conserving. So you just have to think about this one time, make the right changes, and then you're not having to constantly obsess over it about whatever's happening in the water year because you're always efficient. And the way we avoid water crises is by keeping as much as we can in that system. So, we have population, even if we don't have a drought, we're having steady population growth, and we haven't built a major new reservoir in Utah since the 90s, and we are hoping to avoid having to build one. And so, you're looking at like $1 billion if they have to build a new one, plus all of the impact that comes with that. If we can avoid that by simply optimizing the water that's already in our system, it just makes the most sense for everybody to utilize it that way. And so that's really where we're pushing, so that we can avoid those other outcomes that are less desirable.
100%. 100%. That makes so much sense to me. It's not just what we get, it's what we keep, because we can't predict the future. We don't know what's going to happen. Look at the climate change that's going on. Whether you think, no matter what you think climate change is coming from, it's still happening.
Yeah. You're exactly right. It's pretty strongly verified that we have been warmer over the last 100 years. Yes. And that impacts can be longer than you think. Even if we get a lot of rain this spring, that's not the same as snowpack. When we get rain as the water supply, it stays in place and it'll water, your lawn or whatever for the week. But when we have the snowpack and it comes off in the spring melt, it moves over land really quickly. And that's how we fill the reservoirs. Rainfall isn't the reservoir filler, it's the snowpack. And so that's why we're so nervous, right? And so over the last year, when we've had this extreme drought, the soils have been very dry. And so what that means is when we get we only have 75% of normal, and they're expecting substantially less water to reach the reservoirs this year, because as it melts, it's going to stay in place because the soils are going to suck it up because they're so dry, right? So the plants already need that up in the mountains, the soils need it there. And so there isn't extra to shed off over the top of that soil surface and get quickly into our reservoirs. So what we do have is not going to go as far in filling reservoirs this year. And so we really do want to focus on that. And of course, each year we have more and more straws drinking out of the same supply, or relatively the same supply. And so the buffer that we have in our system gets a little bit less each year. We're very lucky in Utah that we've had really good water planning over a long window of time. We are, I think, of the 8 states in the West, we are at the least risk of serious water crises. And that is because of the good planning that's been done on behalf of the state. We want to keep that moving and we want to keep that going. But we have reached a point where it has to be participatory. All of us, I'll constantly hear from people, well, don't tell me about this. My city isn't doing a good enough job, or the school district, or, whoever. But, you control you. Same thing you tell your teenager, right? You control you. So you can manage your own use. And, we have systems in place. We're working with every angle to get conservation in every place that we can by every person. We're talking about homeowners today because that's who's listening to this program, right? And that's the right people to connect with. And because 75% of the drinking water it goes to single family homes. So it's a substantial percentage of that. And of your water use, 65% of your use is your landscape. And that's very surprising to most people. Like the average quarter-acre lot in Utah is using 200,000 gallons of water per season.
Wow.
If it's just a typical lot with the typical most lawn landscape, right? And when you switch that out to a localscape, it just looks like a great yard. No one driving by understands that it's a water efficient landscape. And yet you've dropped your usage by 65%.
Wow.
How much water the landscape requires. And so that's kind of the future that we need to try to get people to. And we think it's a very doable thing, but it will take action over time. And so by, starting with your small projects now, if it gets to the point where it's going to be a requirement, and certain cities have already started with the ordinances making this a requirement on new construction, and you're going to see that proliferate. So just making those little changes now while you can, that fits with your time and your budget. Because if we get to the point where we have to change by crisis, it's going to be expensive. You saw the mess that was California in 2015. People did some really crazy, weird stuff in 2015 that they've now been trying to undo ever since. See, we're trying to avoid that whole mess. So let's just kind of, if it takes a while, it takes a while. Start making small changes. Flip your park strip, switch your side yard, change your planting beds from overhead spray to drip irrigation. And that might involve moving a few sprinkler heads. It's not that hard. It's a little overwhelming if you haven't done it, but it's an afternoon project. You can do it.
Yes.
We have classes to help you with all of those things through localscapes.com. Now, for your listeners that are in Salt Lake County, they also can get through Utah Water Savers. There are landscape rebates available that are paid out by the Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District, which is why the geography is limited, because they can only pay out within their service area. But if you are putting in a yard, you can actually get cash back for localscaping it. And we use that because of how much money we're going to save in having to develop new supply, is how we justify the ability to give those rebates to people, because by doing a more efficient yard, you are saving everybody money, not just, yourself, of course, but also other people. And so, we're really starting to see some really great homeowner localscapes. And that is probably the most rewarding thing to any of our educators, is when we actually see people successfully putting in these beautiful projects. And I have been really impressed with the quality that people have been able to achieve. I got to go back last summer and photograph a bunch of older projects that have been in for 2 years. So how do they still look 2 years later? Are they still looking good? And almost every project still looked really awesome. I was honestly surprised, way better, because nobody knew I was coming. I just did the drive-by, and I was just really impressed with the quality that they've been able to maintain. And it just tells me that this is what works for this climate.
Absolutely. Well, and I've noticed in areas where a lot of the homes are localscaped, they've got beautiful pathways from the front door. They've got like you mentioned earlier, a beautiful seating area to look at an amazing planter bed. Even just in the front yard, and just gorgeous ornamentals and a reasonable sized lawn. They don't look like your square yard boxes with one massive elm tree, pine tree.
Maple, a chlorotic maple.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Well, and when we can get it in a whole neighborhood, and that's why we're really excited. Like a lot of our home builders have started adopting this. We have several home builders that just chose to do it as their standard because it made sense to them that this is what things should look like. But what's neat about it is they're getting that solid foundation in. We expect homeowners are going to continue to improve their landscape, but because the foundation is correct with the way that the sprinklers are done and the way the ground plane is done, then as they're making these small additions, it's not as expensive to them, and it's really enhancing what they already have. And things end up in the right place because they were done with a plan. But the other nice thing too, when it's an entire neighborhood, is you start to see a better flow between properties as well. Instead of your planting bed ends in a weird shape because it has to meet up with the neighbor's grass and whatever else, there's just better flow between the properties. And it just really creates attractive communities. And that's what we all want. We want to preserve those property values. And there is a perception that an efficient landscape is somehow of less value, but not if you do it right. And that's what we're here to teach you.
Absolutely. I love it. Well, Cynthia, this has been so educational for our listeners and inspiring as well. I'd love to have you on the show. Please come back again soon.
Love to chat again.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Gardening Utah. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. As always, let me know what you'd like to see on the show. You can message me on Instagram. Our handle is @GardeningUtah. Or if you hit up the episode notes on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can see links to a lot of things that we talked about today. And you can link over to our social media and check out our Instagram, our Facebook, and send us a message that way as well. And while you're there, make sure you're subscribed to the show. And you know what? Give me a 5-star rating. I would love you for it. And if you give us a review and give us some love, we'll give it right back to you and read it on the show. Thanks again for listening. Shout out to our producer, Lambo. I'm Jana Francis. We'll see you next week here on Gardening Utah. And remember, grow big or go home.
When you're ready to grow big or go home, make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast, Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.
We are supported by ProgressivePlant.com that will thrive in your location. Progressive Plant is passionate about helping homeowners, expert gardeners, novices alike choose the correct plant for your soil. They don't just grow plants, they know plants. Let Progressive Plants help you today. Just go to ProgressivePlant.com and check out their wide selection. You can also go to the Design tab and look at the expert designers that they have that can help you plan your perfect yard. Visit ProgressivePlant.com today.